So it's a great joy for me to welcome and introduce Dr. Jane Williams, who's with us this evening. I messed up the time zones, and so Jane had to get up an hour earlier than she'd anticipated. So I'm very pleased that you were able to join us from dark and cold England as we enjoy a long summer evening here in Australia. Jane is an English theologian and writer. She was born in India, where her father was serving as a missionary priest. And her father later became the principal of the Kerala United Theological Seminary. And when the family eventually returned to England, Geoffrey Paul became Bishop of Hull and then Bradford in the north of England. Jane studied theology at Clare College in Cambridge and has worked in theological publishing and education. For 3 years, she wrote a regular column for the Church Times of lectionary reflections, and they were later collected by SPCK and published. Jane is now Assistant Dean and Lecturer at St Mellitus College in London. She's written a huge number of books on topics as diverse as being a bishop's spouse, called Marriage, Mitres and Being Myself, to a book on Christian funerals and one on the Trinity. But she's also written a number of collections of lectionary reflections and has followed up a previous book, The Art of Advent, with her latest book, The Art of Christmas. And so Jane, it's a real joy to have you with us this evening, especially so early in the morning in an English winter.
It's lovely to be here. And just to say, I actually live in Wales now. Just it's a very important distinction for the Welsh.
Yes, I have a Scots uncle, and he would be equally fierce if I suggested he might live in England as well. So thank you. Jane, I wonder if we could begin by hearing a little about you. You wrote in one of your books that you often get asked to talk about yourself, about your life and your faith, and that long and winding road of the journey with God. And I wonder if you could share a little bit of that journey with us. That journey from growing up in a rectory family to claiming or holding the faith as something of your own, and what that journey was like, and significant moments or people along the way.
Well, as you say, I mean, I had the great privilege of growing up in a Christian family. My parents were missionaries in South India, which is how I came to be born there. So for them, faith was always something that you acted on. It wasn't just part of the background, it was something that you made significant life decisions in relation to. And all their lives they chose interesting callings, not straightforward ones. So we came back from India, and after a short time living in Bristol, my father was warden of a Christian community on the North Devon coast, a place called Lee Abbey, before moving on to be a bishop in the north of England, which he particularly enjoyed because first Hull and then Bradford, where he was when he died, has a large immigrant population, which he felt very at home with, having spent so many years in India. And I, for my own part, I never rebelled against the faith, but I did decide that I needed to work out whether it was my faith or just a family faith. And I think that's the reason why I decided to study theology. Because I thought if I asked myself the hard questions at the highest kind of academic levels, I would work out whether I still believed it or not. And I'm happy to say I do, and found actually God gets bigger and bigger. The more you study God, the more you attend to God, God gets bigger and more exciting. So the kind of fear that some people feel when they start asking questions and start entering into the study of theology, I actually had the opposite experience of discovering the excitement of God, and the realization that any God that I can completely get my head round is probably not worth worshipping. So it's good that there are all kinds of things that I still don't understand and never will till I meet the Lord face to face. And as you say, Jeremy, I now teach theology, and I do recommend that for anybody who wants to really work out what they actually believe. Having to lecture a class of a couple of hundred students who are all going to ask you hard questions is really sharpening of one's faith. I teach in a seminary setting. Our students are called either to ministry in the Anglican Church or to other kinds of ministries, and so for all of them this is a question of, is this something that I trust my life to? Is this something that I allow to shape decisions that I'm going to make? And so it's important that those of us who teach have really tested it ourselves and are attempting to live it. In my case, not wholly successfully, but that's Christian discipleship, isn't it? So obviously I'm also married to somebody who is a Christian priest and theologian, so our poor children never had any choice about the matter.
And in terms of the church, and it's a funny thing being married to a member of the clergy, you're sort of, instantly part of a church community, but some of us have that uneasy relationship with the church, and we see the challenge often of being part of those communities. How's that been for you in terms of making sense of your faith and finding a home for it in this funny old thing that's called the church?
Famously, somebody called Loisy once said Jesus predicted the kingdom and what came was the church, and people have assumed that that was a shame and a disappointment. But actually the point being made is that church is the connecting point between now and the kingdom. So we have to assume that if God instigated the church as the result of Jesus' ministry, then there's something significant about that, and also that God's not stupid. God knew it would be imperfect. God knows us well, and therefore part of what we are is a representative of the new humanity, with our doors open to invite more and more people to come and work out how to try to be the kind of human beings that are in the image of Jesus Christ. That's what the church is for, to help disciples help each other to see Jesus more and more clearly and to try and live like that. So theologically, I find it really significant and important to remember that the church isn't our idea, it's God's. And obviously we're always trying to turn it into our own idea. And make it into something that we can manage, and make it into something that's about power and money and the people that I like and the people that I don't. And that's always having to be corrected by this theology, by the presence and action of the Holy Spirit. But for me, the church is it needs reforming constantly. Constantly challenging. We need critical friends who remind us how little we live up to what we say, but it isn't replaceable. You can't be a Christian without committing to some part of some kind of a community, because, as I say, this is a symbol, a sign and foretaste of the coming kingdom. So it's not just about personal faith, it's always about faith of the people of God for the sake of the world.
And in your work at St Mellitus with theological students, does that give you a sense of hope for the church moving forward? I assume there's younger as well as older students coming in with ideas and vision and enthusiasm.
It really does give me hope. It's one of the things that's been such a privilege all these years about teaching in a seminary, is the way that people who are not blind to the stupidities of the church still commit their lives to working for the church in various kinds of ways. And as you say, they're all ages and increasingly diverse, which is one of the things that gives me huge hope, because the Church of England, at least, has not always been brilliant at enabling people to hear God's call. on their lives, people from different kinds of backgrounds. And we are really trying to get better at that, because until we have people who represent all the people of God in leadership roles, lots of people are not going to be able to hear that God loves them. It's just a simple matter of being able to see yourself loved and represented in the people who are helping to shape and lead the churches. So that does give me huge hope, really huge hope. And there are people, as I say, who are now realistic about the church and know that they're not going into a safe and timid profession, but going into somewhere really pioneering and that's changing all the time. And I just feel it's an enormous privilege to teach in such a setting.
Yeah, terrific. And what about art? You obviously have a love for art, but where does that come from? Were you surrounded by beautiful things growing up, or is it something you've discovered more recently?
There are a number of sort of ways into this. One is that I have a sister who is a painter, and she, from a very early age, taught us all to look at things. And I noticed that I wasn't doing that. That I'm somebody who's usually got my head in a book, and she was really good at making me take my head out of a book occasionally and look at the world around us. So she's been a really significant influence in this. But then I also, as I started to teach, realized that there are so many different kinds of intelligence, and on the whole, the way in which at least British university systems work only really recognises one kind of intelligence, and that's the word-based kind of intelligence that can read and write essays and that kind of thing. I thought that I was really helped by students who said, could you give us some images? Could you give us something to look at? Could you help us actually use all the other parts of our brains and minds and hearts and spirit to engage with God? And I found that such an interesting challenge that I've tried to do that now really regularly in the way that I teach, is actually to help people engage at different kinds of levels. Because as I say, I am myself a word person. I absolutely love words, and words are my way into spiritual experience and encounter with God. But I am just really aware that that's not the only way, and that we are embodied visual people as well, and we listen, we look, we touch, we taste, and that certain parts of particularly academic Christianity haven't really acknowledged that properly. So I began to explore what happens if you use an image to help people engage at different kinds of levels.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's one of the things that really struck me about the book, The Art of Christmas, is the way you approach the paintings. It's sort of not like an art critic or an art historian sort of picking apart the technique or any of those sorts of things, but almost in an act of imagination. And so really using the paintings as a bit of a springboard to reflect on the scriptures. Can you talk a little bit about how we might use imagination in our engagement with art, but also with the scriptures to, I guess, help us to learn to look at things in a different way?
I mean, there are lots of techniques that are deeply embedded in the Christian tradition for doing that. And as you say, Jeremy, I'm not an art historian. I often know remarkably, I obviously try and research the paintings that I use, but I often know remarkably little, and I couldn't talk about the painting technique or anything. So I am using it as a way to explore the scriptures on the whole. But I mean, for example, Ignatian spirituality very often suggests that we imagine ourselves to be part of a scene in the scriptures. So if we're hearing a story of Jesus, to imagine ourselves in that story, and it's often really quite revealing to work out for yourself who you are in that story and what you're reacting to. and to try to be honest about that. So you're not always the heroine or the person who really understands what Jesus is saying, but I strikingly found myself really sympathizing with the older brother in the prodigal son story, when I really did that honestly, and thinking, that it isn't fair, and then being able to explore that in different kinds of ways, and then the ancient practice of lectio divina, just actually listening to the words over and over and over again, and noticing which words and phrases stay in your head and why, and again asking the Holy Spirit to help you in deepen your understanding of why those particular words and phrases are staying with you. I find it immensely helpful reading the scriptures with other people, because we are all different and have different life experiences. They bring lots and lots of different kinds of insights to scripture, and I think we do make it too small by sitting and trying to read it on our own and only read it and not actually engage with it at different kinds of levels. So it's good to sing it. Again, years and years of Christian discipleship have proven that singing the scriptures is a way of getting it into your heart in a different kind of way. What do you do with it, Jeremy? Am I allowed to ask you questions?
Yes. Look, I think finding as many different ways into the stories as possible, and I think I was delighted to discover some new paintings in the collection, and particularly one of Joseph with this chubby little baby, and he holding the infant Jesus and gazing lovingly at this small child who was reaching up to play with his beard. And I think, as you say, being able to enter into that place, and one of the things you do in some of the reflections is begin to imagine some of the feelings and emotions and thoughts that might be happening in the paintings that are not in the scriptures, but we can imagine if we put ourselves in that place. Yeah.
And I have developed a particular affection for Joseph over the years. There is such a humility about that role that he's willing to play, and it is striking that Jesus talks so positively about fatherhood, and clearly he's primarily talking about the fatherhood of God, but you can't help thinking he must have had a good experience of being fathered by Joseph, perhaps, that feeds into that, the way that he uses that language. And as you say, that's me imagining, that's not there in the scriptures. But so long as you use the scriptures as you allow the scriptures to correct your imagination, I think we're allowed to imagine.
And it's the gift of someone like Joseph, about whom we know so little, that we can do that work. And it's almost like Jewish midrash, where we begin to think about it in another way, and bring our own stories to it as well. It seems to me that it's a very different way of using or understanding art to how we use icons. If I understand it right, if you want to make sense of an icon, you need to know how to read them, and you need to know what each element means, and particular hand gestures mean particular things, and we can identify characters by the way they're painted or written in iconography. I get far fewer clues when I look at a painting. How do we begin to enter into that understanding of art? That painting of Joseph, if it wasn't called in the title of the painting, it didn't refer to Joseph and Jesus, it could just be a grandfather and a baby. So what are the clues, and what are the things that you connect with when you enter into that process?
As you say, icons are different, and that's partly comes out of that very rigorous history of questioning whether it's appropriate to use images at all, given the very clear biblical bar to using images, particularly of the divine. And as you know, there was a huge controversy in the Eastern Church about whether it was appropriate to use imagery about the divine and about the apostles and so on, which is why that very clear set of definitions was evolved, so that you're not in any way under the impression that what you're seeing is an actual picture of the divine or of the people involved. So you're always seeing a set of symbols that help you connect with what's beyond in iconography. Now, interestingly, that in the West, we don't seem to have had that similar level of critical debate about the proper uses of imagery. And it was one of the things that the reformers hated, which is why they went around smashing so many things, is that they didn't think that that people had thought theologically about what was going on, and they were afraid that people were imagining that they were actually seeing a picture of Jesus, which clearly we don't. What we're seeing is an artist's imagination, and so I think there really is a debate about how we use images, but equally, there should be a debate about how we use words, because you can't prescribe what people are doing with what is put in front of them in whatever format it's put in front of them. Those of you who preach will know that. You think you said one thing and people come up and thank you for something you didn't realize you said at all. And that is just part of the art of human communication, isn't it? Is that whatever you share with somebody else goes into their mind, into their heart, into their imagination, and is used in very different kinds of ways. And so for me, that is actually part of the point of using images, is that I'm not dictating what's happening there. I'm trying, and I know I'm not. I'm much more tempted to think I'm dictating when I'm speaking, but when I'm putting an image in front of somebody and giving them what I think is some guidance about how they might approach it, I'm really obviously opening myself up to their participation in that process. And I think, again, the painters who painted Christian subjects were making clear theological choices. They had to think, how am I going to depict this? So just in the same way as we do when we're giving a sermon or a talk, you make choices about the shape of it. So the painters likewise have engaged with the topic and are making clear decisions about what they will portray. The habit, for example, of always portraying Joseph as an old man, to make it clear what his relationship with Mary was and wasn't. There's real thought gone into that. And if you talk to somebody who really is an art historian, really does know their stuff, you can learn. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating to think of the theology of painting Christian topics, the kind of preparation and engagement that artists have to make in that. But as I say, I think it's partly the fact that you're not prescriptive about how people are approaching that you are really giving permission for people to engage with an image in a way that works for them. People will see different things in paintings, notice different details, engage in different kinds of ways. As a matter of fact, as they do with all presentations of the gospel, it seems to be a bit more liberating with images. I'm a little bit, in a way, ashamed of what I do with using paintings, although I love doing it, because the images don't do the same thing as the words. They reach a different part of the intelligence, as I say, and if you could put paintings in words, you wouldn't need paintings. So what's going on in the painting can't actually be put in the words. And again, I hope the kind of commentaries I write around the paintings are, I hope, permission giving to people to think, oh, well, she thinks that, but what I think is happening is this. And as I say, there's something a little bit liberating about putting an image and inviting people to engage with it and see what they see. So really, I should love to, anybody who's actually reading the book or looking at some of those paintings, I'd love to hear their responses to it, and not just take mine for granted.
And I think, there's something in the Anglican aesthetic that invites engagement with art and with music and poetry and all of those things. And the gift of artists and musicians and poets is that they can invite us just to shift slightly and see things from a different place. One of the fascinating things about those classical paintings is the way they seek to interpret the story in the context of an Italian villa, in the Tuscany hills and in the clothes of the time. And so it immediately shifts people into another place, and that's something that's
And that it does, absolutely right, Jeremy. And the problem with that is that sometimes, again, that just that can just put it back in the past again. Whereas what the painters were doing was putting it in their present. So they're painting the scenes that they're familiar with. And that's something I'd love us to think about as we engage with the pictures. Okay, so where would I put Elizabeth and Mary embracing on the street next round the corner from me? Where would I put Jesus engaging with the children in the playground where my grandchildren go, or whatever, and do what those artists are doing, which is imagine the reality of the Son of God living with us.
There's a terrific Australian artist, Rod Moss, and I used one of his images on a Christmas card this year, and he takes some of the classical paintings and reinterprets them in the context of the First Nations community around Alice Springs, and it's that incarnational stuff that really, again, shifts our focus and invites us to think about things in a slightly different way. What is it, do you think, about Advent and Christmas and probably Lent and Easter, or probably the whole of the Christian story, that lends itself to this sort of deep engagement with in art? For a number of years in different parishes, I invited local artists to paint the Stations of the Cross, and many of those artists had nothing really to do with the church, but there was something that they were able to engage with and create, some wonderful art. But is there something about this story that we hold that lends itself particularly to art?
Interesting question. I mean, I think there's something about this season of Advent. I think I've really noticed over the last decade or so a real growth in people actually wanting to engage with Advent. I think a lot of people noticed that Christmas starts earlier and earlier, preparations for Christmas start earlier and earlier, that it was becoming a season that was simply about parties and gifts and important rejoicings, but that had begun to lose touch with the Christian message, and so increasingly I've noticed that people do want to engage with Advent, do want to engage with preparation for Christmas, not just Christmas itself. So I think this season, again, with the wonderful resources that the church's tradition give us of remembering that this wasn't a last minute idea of God's for the Son to be born at Christmas, but that it's been prepared for throughout That's why we commemorate the prophets and the patriarchs and John the Baptist and all those who prepared the way, prepared our imaginations, prepared our understanding of the scriptures for this great act of God. But I think you're right, Jeremy, that the story itself, the whole story of God's commitment to us from creation through to fulfillment, and God's commitment to the point where God comes to live with us, is an incredibly powerful story, and that we often underrate it. I think as Christians, those of us who've sort of grown up with it, forget that we're saying something that is quite different from the way in which the world often understands itself. That we're saying this is not a random event with no meaning. We're saying that our lives, even those of us who have can't see that we're having any impact, nonetheless our lives are significant. Every one of us is known and utterly beloved. That we're saying something quite countercultural to most of the ways in which others read the world, and that it is good news, that our God is faithful, committed, active, and loving. And obviously it's a story that has shaped the imagination of the world coming out of Christendom for centuries and centuries. So there are all kinds of things that you can't understand unless you know something of the Christian story. Universities are often now having to put on some pre-term educational systems to help people understand why Shakespeare, what's going on in the story of the Merchant of Venice, what's happening with Shylock and all that. So there's so much of our culture that is actually deeply, deeply soaked in the Christian story, not which people are often quite ignorant about now. And I don't want to be triumphalistic about it, because obviously a lot of people have rejected that story, partly because of the way that we as Christians have lived it and imposed it. But nonetheless, I would want to suggest it is still a story to live in, a story to shape us.
And I think that, no matter whether you come from a place of deep faith or not, there are things in the story that that people will connect with. I was fascinated wandering around an exhibition of old masters in Brisbane recently, and wondering what people made of some of this deeply religious art, and yet people connected, and whether they were connecting just with the beauty or with the story or something else. There were connections, and so it does provide a way in that the words might not.
I think that's right, and I think it is partly that not being prescriptive, isn't it? Some years ago there was an enormously successful exhibition of Christian paintings called Seeing Salvation at the National Gallery in London, and people, commentators and critics were utterly taken aback at how popular it was. And I think it was that sense of not being told what you have to believe, that you're allowed to look at the paintings and engage with them in ways that make sense to you. And there is that sort of liberating element to pictures, and actually possibly to music as well. Again, there's a major London church that just has a regular program of sacred music at lunchtime for city workers. In the old days when people came to work in the city before the pandemic, people used simply to come in and spend their lunch hour just listening. And again, it was a sense that they weren't being told what they had to believe. Now, I'm a theologian; I want to tell people what they have to believe, but you can't do that if people are not ready, and you can't do that. You can really put people off if you're not attending to where they are and what questions they're actually asking.
And Jane, I can't remember in the art of Advent, but certainly in the art of Christmas, they're all very old paintings. Do you have a particular is there a period for you that is the high point or your favourite, or was it just coincidence that this particular set came from a particular time?
Well, I'm going to admit a very terrible thing, Jeremy, which is that I normally have a rough idea of what I want to say, and then I'm afraid I look for a picture that will help me say it. Now, sometimes, I'm so sorry, it's a terrible, terrible thing to say. Sometimes it works, it doesn't work, because I look at what I want to say and I find a picture that I think will help me say it, and then the picture makes me say something else sometimes. But because I am a theologian rather than an artist, I mean, I do think an artist would do this differently. And I think it would be really, really interesting to get a real art historian or an artist to do such a compilation. And so I tend to do my research with paintings that are more readily available. I do occasionally come by that wonderful alchemy of the internet, come across a painting that I'd never heard of before or noticed before, and I'm able to engage with that. But obviously these classical paintings are the ones that are easiest to find, and often people are a bit familiar with them, so already their imaginations are starting to engage with them. So I'm sure there would be better ways of doing them, but that's the honest, truthful way that I do it.
Do you have a favourite though?
I mean, I go through obsessive periods. I'm not going to be able to find it. I mean, this extraordinary. I don't know that it's exactly my favourite, but there's a most extraordinary painting of the Visit of the Three Wise Men by Bruegel, which is, if you haven't ever come across it, do Google it. The Three Wise Men look like really dodgy characters, actually, and they're sort of greasy and dirty and generally unreliable looking. And there's an armed soldier standing in the background. There's somebody who looks like the kind of person who sells you things that fell off the back of a lorry, whispering in Joseph's ear in this painting. You sort of think, what's going on? And there's the infant Jesus naked in the middle of all of these heavily clothed, heavily armed adults all around, and it's the most extraordinary painting, and I keep coming back to it because it's talking about the entry of the Son of God into this utterly fallen world, and the complete vulnerability, the way in which God the Son just gives himself into our hands, utterly naked, utterly at our mercy. And all around, people are already beginning to either work him into their world, make him fit their values, work out how they're going to ignore him. I mean, it is the most extraordinary painting. And then one of the kings who is black at one side of the picture, again, such an enigmatic figure, absolutely beautiful, regal figure, standing on one side, apparently not participating in what's going on. As you can see, I've got completely obsessed with this painting at the moment. So if you don't know it, do go and have a little Google. It's Peter Bruegel, and it's the visitor. It's the visit of the Magi, and see what you make of it. It's so unusual.
Mm. And so much going on, and I only just noticed the donkey at the back there.
Yeah. And the donkey's face. Notice the donkey's face. It echoes some of the human faces. There's definitely a comment there about who's the animal and who's the human, I think. So yeah. Apologies to those of you who haven't actually got the book in front of you, but I hope that might be something you might enjoy looking up.
Terrific. Jane, there's a question from Godfrey Fryer. I think it's from you, Godfrey, or from Bronwyn. I'm not sure who was typing. But would you like to unmute and one or both of you ask the question?
I think Bronwyn did the first one.
Yeah, and we've been working, Jane, actually almost liturgically a couple of years now with The Art of Advent book. We used it last year at evening prayer. We have a look because we say evening prayer together, and it's a book I found a wonderful, portable, terrific format book. And I've given it as a gift to lots of people. And I'm, quite often when we in Australia or in the Southern Hemisphere pick up books that might have been written in the Northern Hemisphere about Advent, you're going into a completely different season.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the things I've really appreciated about this book is that it's not worried about that seasonal piece, that you're heading into darkness with Advent. We're actually in high summer with Advent, which is such a different experience. So that's one of the things I've really appreciated about the book. And then a little further on, I've asked the question, but then you and Jeremy, in your discussion, were actually replying to it. I've been amazed with this one, the variety of the paintings. Now, maybe in the Art of Christmas, Jeremy, you were saying they're more of a particular era of painting where, there was one in here by a Chinese artist, there's an Australian Aboriginal one from Africa, marvellous one from Ethiopia. And I think, how do you find all these paintings? But you were replying that sometimes you think, this is what I would like, or the direction from which I'd like to come. How can I find a painting to fit that? So yes, it's a bit of to and fro, I suppose. Yes.
I was very interested in your comment, Jane, that you found the picture first, and then because it was a picture that you thought, yes, I can write something about that. And I thought, wow, isn't that wonderful freedom? Because preachers are stuck with the lectionary. And I did write something there about Joseph. I was trying to think about, is there any icon I can think of that actually features Joseph? And I can't think of one. The incarnation will be about Mary, with Jesus, in a sense, presenting Jesus. And I wondered there whether, is it that the orthodoxy focuses mainly on theological matters rather than just being descriptive of relationships, which is the way of the West, and because we haven't got any boundaries.
Mm. Well, that's an interesting challenge. If I'll have to go away and do some research and see if I can find an icon of Joseph, Godfrey, and then I'll email you. Okay.
Thank you.
But actually, that Bronwyn, the Aboriginal painting was one I came across entirely by accident.
Right.
And I thought, wow.
Yes.
And I that was one that made me write rather than the other way around. I found the picture and thought I actually do need to engage with that one. So.
Yes. And yeah, and the Ethiopian one, which I think was actually amazing, from Tigray, of the I think it's Moses, or it's the patriarchs, and it's probably a very ancient fresco, I imagine, but it has an amazingly modern look, and the looks on their faces are absolutely astonished, as you might imagine they might be. So when you read some of the biblical stories about them, so it was a wonderfully sort of ancient painting that actually sort of looked very modern in its style. Jane, there's one lovely piece that Godfrey and I both find really wonderful piece that you wrote in this Art of Advent one on the Tanner painting, the Henry Ossawa Tanner, the Annunciation one. And you wrote, Advent prepares us for the reality that there is only one story of the world, only one destiny for it from before all time, and that is for it to find its fulfillment through the Son of God. We can choose not to be involved in telling the world its story, but we cannot choose to make another story because we are not God. And I found that an amazing thing that I often contemplate on during Advent.
And Jane, how do you think we find the space, you know, amongst the noise of, yeah, as you say, you know, we've had hot cross buns in the shops since just after Easter. You know, they clear out the Easter eggs and the hot cross buns are in, and the carols start playing in September. And so there's so much noise. How do we find the space to tell that story?
I mean, I think the simple truth is that we find space for what we think is important, don't we? And so it is one of the real challenges that each of us needs, I think, to set ourselves is what, if we look at our daily lives, our weekly lives, our monthly lives, what does it look as though we value most? Where are we actually spending our time, our money, our energy? And it's a salutary thing to ask ourselves. And obviously some things we don't have any choice about. You do have to go to work, you do have to earn your living, you do have to eat, you know, those kind of things. But actually most of us have quite a lot of time in which we engage with social media or watch television, or, you know, as a matter of fact, we do make space for things that we want to make space for. And so again, I think Advent and these big seasons, Advent, Lent and so on, where we're given a real reason to reset our lives, are hugely important. And that all the ancient, all the tradition of Christianity would say that prayer and attention to God is like any other muscle; it needs to be exercised. And if you stop exercising it, it gets harder and harder. The less you pray, the harder it is to pray. The less you read the Bible, the harder it is to read the Bible. And that's just true of any human skill, isn't it? Any human commitment. So I'm preaching this sermon to myself as much as to anybody else. It is really easy to let it be pushed to the edges of our lives when we say it's the centre of our lives, when we say it's the thing that gives meaning to our lives, but it doesn't look as though we actually believe that often in the way that we spend our time. So I think it is just a challenge to reset, and then just to make it a daily discipline. You wouldn't go to work without cleaning your teeth. Don't go to work without engaging with God. Obviously it takes a little bit longer probably to read a passage of scripture and pray, but just simply to make it a discipline. And then and again, the lectionary year is really good at, you know, times when you have ordinary time where you just do the basics, and then times when you give a bit more time, Advent, Lent, Easter and so on, and go with those kind of rhythms. But I just think we have no hope of telling that story to others if we're not really living in it ourselves.
And the church year is a great gift, as you say, in that it gives us a frame or some scaffold, and into that we can layer all sorts of things. And I think one of the gifts of these two little books, The Art of Advent and The Art of Christmas, is that it gives us something else to layer in, and a way into the story of this time of the year, and then we can add in some beautiful music, and we can add in some other things, but here's one way in that might help us,
because our imaginations are get quite jaded. We tend to stay in rhythms and routines, and there's nothing wrong with that, but just every so often a picture or a piece of music or a conversation can sort of suddenly jerk you awake again, and that's a good thing.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if there's any more questions, but it's been absolutely delightful just to sit and chat, and I thank you so much for getting up and being part of the conversation with us, and certainly wish you every blessing for the rest of the Advent journey. I hope things, now that the academic year is on pause for a bit, you get a bit of downtime over Christmas and New Year while we go into the long summer break here. So
it's been lovely to be with you, and I've very much enjoyed seeing a fan on and somebody's in the background, so imagining you in a completely different kind of setting. Again, it's a great sign of hope. There is summer somewhere in the world at the moment. That's good
yes.
to know.
I have the cooler on in my study here. So,
wonderful.
And please be assured of our prayers. We watch the news from the United Kingdom and COVID with alarm, as we're in a very different space here, and borders here are just opening up, so we're not sure what to anticipate, but we're certainly mindful of all that you've been through in the United Kingdom, so be assured of our prayers for you.
Thank you, Jeremy.
And every blessing for Christmas. And so thank you, Jane, and thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. And I wish you all every blessing as you journey towards Christmas. And thank you for being part of the conversation.
Thank you,
Thank you so much.